What's up, nerds? For the first time in history, Iran has attacked Israel directly. Now, this follows the Israeli strike in Damascus a couple weeks ago, which killed 2 IRGC generals. Now, we already talked about that strike, but we're going to go ahead and talk about the Iranian strike and what that means and what could come next. We already spoke about that strike in a video whenever basically that strike happened, but we waited after that video until Iran would respond, and respond they did. Now, I'm recording this video on April 15th, 2024. I wanted to wait a day not only to collect some more information about what has happened, kind of get a clear battle damage assessment on what was hit and how bad the hits were, but I also wanted to give some time to see if Israel would respond quickly or how long that's going to take. So we're going to go ahead and talk about that as well here at the end of this video. On the evening of April 13th, Iran launched over 300 Shahed drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles, all directly from the territory of Iran directly towards Israel. Now, it is very important to note that this all came directly from Iranian territory. There was some speculation that this could be a response that would go through Iranian proxies, but the fact that it comes from Iran proper, it has pretty significant diplomatic meaning to it, meaning that there's no more pretense, there's no more veil or deniability that this could just be a rogue proxy or whatever, a proxy acting independently. No, this was Iran, and it's pretty clear as day that it was, and Iran spoke to it and took responsibility for these strikes. If Iran had responded via proxies, I think that would have been a pretty de-escalatory statement on their end, basically saying that they're going to respond, but they're not going to respond in a way that would risk a larger war. But it would not necessarily have deterred either the United States or Israel from attacking more IRGC officials in the future. Since Iran struck from their territory directly, it is actually pretty escalatory, and the size and scope of these attacks were also pretty escalatory, and we'll talk about that here in a second. Again, there's just no more pretense. This isn't the work of a proxy. This is the work of Iran proper. These are uniformed Iranian soldiers launching missiles at Israel. Now, of course, this could prompt an Israeli response depending on the scope of these attacks, and the scope was pretty significant. According to some officials, these strikes were the worst case scenario that I saw while these attacks were going on. There were some strikes at least around about the same time from Hezbollah, though not in a significant quantity, but also those strikes from Hezbollah have kind of been going on the entire time, so I'm not quite sure we can confidently say that those were linked. However, these strikes kind of were comprised of over 100 Shahed drones, 30-something cruise missiles, and then over 100 ballistic missiles. And most of those Shahed drones were intercepted en route to Israel. The speed of the Shahed drone is actually pretty slow. It flies at about 125 miles per hour. So it was going to take like 9 hours for those to fly from Iran to Israel. And that is a pretty significant lead time that Israeli defenses and its partners could start to identify and intercept those drones. Now, the list of countries that were helping intercept these drones and missiles is a pretty interesting list. It of course includes, the US, the UK, and France, which isn't necessarily a surprise. However, what was a surprise was that Jordan and Saudi Arabia were also involved. Now, that is a pretty interesting thing, and we're going to get to that here in just a second. Now, of course, the wave of drones basically screened for ballistic missiles to be launched and get a bit closer, and that we're aware of. They were targeting military sites, but because a lot of these, drones and missiles were intercepted, we're just not going to know for sure. We just know that one IDF airbase in Negev was impacted, and of course, that airbase in Negev that was hit was the airbase where the aircraft that hit the Iranian consulate in Damascus came from. Now, according to Israel, only military sites were targeted. However, civilians have been injured, but fortunately, at least that I've seen, nobody has died. Shortly after the attack, Israel released a statement that 99% of the drones and missiles were intercepted, which is a pretty remarkable interception rate. I think that was, for 300, munitions flying at you, a 99% interception rate is a pretty darn impressive, even if that included the help of other countries. But that's really, a benefit that Israel has in having distance from Iran, because there's just a lot of room to identify those incoming threats and intercept them. With the exception really of ballistic missiles, but even those being intercepted fairly quickly. Of course, it does help that those Shaheds, which made up a pretty sizable portion of this attack, were so slow and launched so far away. They could spend a lot of their time, intercepting the ballistic and cruise missiles, and then basically have a lunch, take a nap, and then still have time to intercept the Shahed drones. Now, while this attack was going on, in fact, the missiles were still in the air whenever the Iranian delegation to the United Nations basically waved their hands and said, hey, good game, bro, let's call it off. But that's kind of not how any of this works. In the Iranian statement, they stated that they considered the matter to be resolved. But Israel received that statement and said, yeah, but like no. And they have also vowed a very harsh response, but we haven't quite seen that yet. Israel then called for a meeting at the United Nations Security Council, and that was for 4 p.m. on Sunday the 13th. Now, at the time of the attack, I saw some unverified reports that Israel knew in advance that these attacks were happening. However, I've seen later that Iran had briefed Saudi Arabia and Iraq that they were going to launch these attacks so that way both countries knew that these missiles were going to overfly their territory, so that way they could protect their airspace. Now, Saudi Arabia is reported to have turned and told the United States and Israel that this was going to happen, and that gave both countries a lead time to defend. Saudi Arabia then made a pretty dramatic move and released a statement saying that Iran instigated the war in Gaza as an attempt to derail the diplomatic normalization efforts between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which I think is a pretty bold move on their part. It's kind of saying the quiet part out loud, and that was very unexpected. You know, remember, with the war in Gaza, Israel has not gained a lot of goodwill in the Arab world. And so for Saudi Arabia to kind of turn and say, listen, Israel, we kind of got your back, that's a pretty big deal. And that's something that we're just going to have to continue to monitor to see, you know, if that continues to go further. I think it really depends on where the war in Gaza goes, where a war with Hezbollah would go, and kind of how the situation with Iran plays out. Because remember, Saudi Arabia and Iran are not pals. They are not friends. And if Israel and Saudi Arabia were to normalize their diplomatic relationship, that could pose huge challenges for Iran in the future. Now, with this attack basically fully intercepted, Biden and Netanyahu spoke on phone, and Biden told Netanyahu that this was a win and to just take the win and to not, you know, push this situation any further. Some argue that it's not a win because, of course, Iran just attacked Israel directly with 300, missiles and drones. And I think that that's fair. I mean, this is a pretty bold situation. That's a bold move that they did. Remember, whenever the United States killed Qasem Soleimani, Iran launched several ballistic missiles at U.S. air bases. However, it wasn't 300 of those things. Objectively, on paper, this is an act of war. But again, this is in response to the Israeli airstrike in Damascus. That would be considered an act of war. And again, also consider that the generals that they killed were coordinating attacks on Israel via proxies. So you could argue that that's an act of war. And that kind of takes us back to the spiral where these countries have been basically in a quiet war for a number of years now between Israel and Iranian proxies. But now we're just throwing the proxies to the side. Now it's Iran itself attacking Israel. So that isn't necessarily a win, because now we're moving closer towards something that nobody really wants to see happen. But at the same time, Iran launched these attacks. The attack was blunted, and Iran basically said, okay, we're done now. And I think that could be considered a win. Now, Biden, of course, asserts that nothing of value was hit, nobody died. And Iran very much has the capability to make that happen if they wanted to. And that it is a win that they chose not to do that. And I think that is also very fair. I will say, though, that it is a win that we got to see what an exoatmospheric interception looks like. That is absolutely sick. I didn't know that they would look like that, and now you get to know that too. Now, I'd say right now the ball's very much in Israel's court, and pretty much everything hinges on what an Israeli response looks like if they choose to respond. Iran's attack was larger than anticipated, but it was still small enough that Israel and its allies could successfully defend against the attack. Again, consider that Iran has a pretty large proxy network to include Hezbollah, and that most of these groups have their own kinds of rocket forces. If Iran wanted to get something through this defense network, they absolutely could have done that through saturation attacks and really just a much, much larger in scope kind of attack. And they've threatened to do so. They've released statements directly, to Israel via not directly. They've released statements to Israel basically threatening that if Israel responds to, the Iranian attack, then the Iranian response to Israel's attack would be tenfold what we just saw. Iran's believed to have somewhere around 3,000 ballistic missiles. And, the drones, like the Shaheds, they're cheap and easy to produce. Iran could certainly saturate Israeli defenses in a pretty large attack, both with drones and lighter rockets. and then that would allow ballistic missiles to get through. Now, that's just with Iran striking. When paired with strikes from Hezbollah and other groups, this could become a really dangerous situation very, very quickly. Now, it's a win that we didn't see that happen in this attack, and I think that that kind of tells us what Iran's goals are right now. They looked tough in an attack, and I think that tough stance was really more for Iranian audiences, saying, look, we responded in kind to the Israeli attack. We did it in a pretty large way, and now the matter is resolved. So if Israel, attacks us again, then we're going to attack tenfold. But of course, Israel has its own incentive to respond to the attack because, look, Iran just attacked Israel from Iranian territory, and that kind of thing cannot be allowed to stand. That's an act of war. Iran got a chance to look tough, extend an olive branch, and call it a day. Netanyahu's now basically dealing with the same issue that Iran had to deal with before that situation, though, where he wants to look tough, but he also doesn't want to downplay what just happened. There was another report that I thought was very interesting that might be slightly exaggerated, citing one U.S. official stating that at least 50% of the ballistic missiles launched by Iran either failed to launch or crashed en route, which that's a huge number. We don't have necessarily insight to disprove that statement, but if that's true, then that's hilarious. And that kind of makes you wonder, the state of Iran's ballistic missile fleet, because that's supposed to be, one of their biggest military deterrences right now. Certainly the missiles that do work are incredibly dangerous and can be a huge problem. But if 50% of them aren't coming out of the launch tubes or not even going to make it to the target, then that's a pretty big deal. Now, with an Israeli response pending, the United States has stated that it is not going to help Israel with a response. And Biden has been trying to get Netanyahu to basically stand down and, not take this situation another step further. Of course, the United States is not in a good position to handle another war in the Middle East, and this kind of war in the Middle East would certainly be the worst and far worse than anything that we've seen so far. That basically leaves Israel's options limited and what it can do in response. It has limited capacity to strike Iran in its own territory, and certainly not in proportional force. But it can still go after Iran's nuclear infrastructure. But that, again, now we're kind of getting into territory where kind of increasing the escalation between each attack to the point where that could easily spiral out of control, and now we're in a war. We could basically assess that this is an inflection point right now in this conflict where Israel can take the off-ramp that Iran is wanting to take right now and not take this conflict any further, and basically just focus on Hamas and Hezbollah and not, get into a war with Iran right now directly. However, if they were to respond, at least especially in a very large capacity, and if they were to target nuclear infrastructure, I think that kind of, forgoes that off-ramp, and we're moving into very dangerous territory. Now, the Israeli War Cabinet met on Sunday the 14th, and they agreed that retaliation was needed. They just disagreed on when and how that retaliation should happen. I think that is important. Israel really needs American support, especially just with the conflicts that they're dealing with right now with Hamas and Hezbollah. And a war with Iran that the United States doesn't want to get involved in, Israel's ill-positioned to handle that kind of a conflict unless they have, the buy-in of all of its allies, specifically its largest ally. Now, as of now, no response has happened yet, but of course, we're going to continue to monitor this situation, and we'll post about it whenever it does happen, kind of assess where we're at then. So subscribe to this channel if you want to follow along with that. Also subscribe for more analysis, not only on this conflict, but with the war in Ukraine and other conflict areas as they pop up. And like this video if you found it helpful or informative. Also comment your thoughts on what you think about this whole situation. I want to hear your thoughts about, what do you think that the Iranian attack really signified? What do you, think that an Israeli response should look like, or should there even be an Israeli response? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Let's kind of continue this conversation, and I will see you all next time. Later.